It had been years since I felt anything but the steady hum of routine. My days were predictable. Early mornings with a quiet cup of coffee, afternoons spent in an office that felt frozen in time, and evenings filled with the soft glow of my lamp as I read novels that once stirred my soul but now seemed only to pass the hours. At 53, life had settled into a rhythm that I convinced myself was comfortable, even as loneliness whispered otherwise. Grocery shopping was one of those mundane tasks I performed on autopilot every Saturday morning. The familiar aisles, the sterile overhead lighting, the soft murmur of other shoppers. It was all so ordinary that I never expected anything to change. But that morning, as I reached for a box of tea on the highest shelf, he appeared. "Here, let me help," he said, his voice light and warm. Before I could refuse, his hand had already retrieved the box and handed it to me. I looked up, startled, and my breath caught. He couldn't have been more than 30, with an easy smile and dark eyes that seemed to hold a spark of curiosity. His hair fell carelessly over his forehead, and there was something unguarded about him, something vibrant. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. He nodded, lingering for a moment as if waiting for something more. "Tea's a good choice," he added, glancing at the box in my hand. "I'm more of a coffee person, though." I laughed, a soft, unpracticed sound. "Tea keeps me grounded. Coffee makes me jittery." We exchanged a few more words, light and inconsequential, before he moved on, leaving me standing there with a box of Earl Grey and an unfamiliar flutter in my chest. It was a fleeting moment, but it stayed with me for the rest of the day, replaying in my mind like the faint notes of a melody I couldn't quite place. Who was he? What was it about that brief encounter that felt so alive? I couldn't explain it, but for the first time in years, I felt the quiet hum of my routine falter, as if the world had shifted just slightly. Could a single moment with a stranger really make me question the life I thought I had accepted? The next time I saw him, it wasn't planned. At least, not on my part. I'd found myself lingering in the same grocery store a week later, half hoping, half dismissing the idea that I might see him again. It felt ridiculous, childish even, to place any significance on our brief interaction. But there he was, near the produce section, inspecting a carton of strawberries, deciding if they're worth it. I asked before I could stop myself. He turned, surprised, then smiled. "They're hit or miss this time of year. Any tips for picking the good ones?" "I'm afraid I usually just go for luck," I said, feeling the corners of my mouth lift. Before I knew it, we were walking through the aisles together, our conversation moving as easily as if we were old friends. His name was Daniel. He worked odd hours at a nearby coffee shop and liked to cook when he had the time. I found myself sharing more than I'd expected, little things, like my preference for baking over cooking and how I always kept a vase of fresh flowers at home. "I'd never have guessed you're into baking," he said, grabbing a bag of flour. "Why not?" I asked, curious. He shrugged. "You seem more like someone who'd have a bookshelf full of serious novels. Not exactly the apron and oven type." I laughed. "I can be both, can't I?" "Fair point," he said, his grin teasing. That conversation was the first of many. Over the next few weeks, I started running into him more often, though I suspected now that we both lingered in the same aisles on purpose. He would ask about my favorite recipes or recommend books he thought I might like. It wasn't much, just fleeting moments that added a new rhythm to my days. One evening, as I sat at home with a cup of tea, I realized how much I looked forward to those encounters. There was a lightness to our conversations, a sense of ease I hadn't felt in years. Why was I allowing myself to enjoy his company so much? Wasn't it foolish to think someone so young could genuinely enjoy talking to me? But the more I tried to push those thoughts away, the more I found myself smiling at the memory of his laugh, his gestures, the way his eyes crinkled when he joked. It was unsettling and exhilarating all at once. Could something so innocent be the start of something more? Or was I simply reading too much into a friendship that he, perhaps, saw as nothing more than casual? The moment it hit me, I was standing in my kitchen, stirring a pot of soup. The recipe was one Daniel had mentioned during one of our conversations. I had jotted it down on a whim, not expecting to try it. Yet here I was, tasting the broth and wondering if it had turned out the way he described. That was when the realization crept in. Why was I thinking of him at all? Why did his voice echo in my mind when I cooked? Why did my chest feel lighter when I imagined his smile? I leaned on the counter, spoon in hand, as the truth unfolded before me, uninvited and unavoidable. I had started to care for him, not just in a friendly, casual way, but in a way that unsettled me to my core. I was a woman in my 50s. He was barely in his 20s. The gap wasn't just in years, it was in life experience, in perspective, in the way the world saw us. How could I possibly allow myself to feel this way? But denying it didn't make it go away. Every memory of his laughter, every shared glance, every moment of his attention felt like a thread pulling me closer to something I couldn't define. That evening, I paced the length of my living room, trying to untangle my thoughts. I should have been horrified, ashamed even, but all I could feel was a strange, tentative kind of hope. Could it be possible that he saw me the way I saw him? The idea was absurd, and yet there were moments, weren't there? The way he leaned in when I spoke, how he remembered the small details I mentioned. Was it my imagination? Or had there been a flicker of something deeper in his eyes when he looked at me? The soup bubbled on the stove, forgotten, as I sat on the couch, my head in my hands. What was I doing? I was old enough to be his mother. The world would see me as foolish, desperate even. Could I risk the judgment? The whispers? And what of him? Would he feel burdened by my feelings, or worse, pity me for them? The questions swirled in my mind, each one heavier than the last. I had spent years guarding my heart, wrapping it in the armor of routine and solitude. Letting anyone in felt like a risk I wasn't sure I could take. But with Daniel, it wasn't just about risk. It was about a possibility I hadn't dared to dream of for years. Was it worth opening myself to the pain of rejection for even the faintest chance of something real? Or was this something I needed to bury before it could grow into something more? I stared at the forgotten soup pot, my heart pounding with questions I didn't yet have the courage to answer. In the days that followed, my emotions were a chaotic storm. Every time I saw Daniel, my heart betrayed me, beating faster, my breath catching in ways I couldn't control. Yet I tried to maintain a facade of calm, as though nothing had changed. The next time we met, it was at a coffee shop, his suggestion. He greeted me with his usual enthusiasm, pulling out a chair for me before sitting down. I should have been at ease, but his warmth made my stomach twist in knots. "You're quiet today," he said, concern flickering in his eyes. "Everything okay?" I nodded quickly, too quickly. "Just tired. Long week." He didn't press me, but the way he looked at me, as though trying to decipher what I wasn't saying, made me feel exposed. How could I explain that I was battling feelings I had no right to have? As we sipped our drinks, the conversation meandered, touching on light topics. Yet every laugh, every shared smile felt like fuel to the fire I was trying to extinguish. He spoke about his plans, his dreams, and his unguarded enthusiasm for life made me feel both envious and alive in ways I hadn't felt in years. Later that evening, I stood by my bedroom window, staring out at the dark street below. The questions that had haunted me before returned, more insistent than ever. Was I selfish for even entertaining the idea of more with him? He had his whole life ahead of him, while I was nearing the later chapters of mine. Could I ever be enough for someone like him? Yet, even as doubt clawed at me, another thought pushed its way forward. What if I was denying myself happiness out of fear? What if I had been so conditioned to stay within the boundaries of what society deemed acceptable that I was missing out on something extraordinary? I leaned against the window frame, my reflection staring back at me, filled with uncertainty. When Daniel smiled at me, it didn't feel like pity or politeness. It felt real, genuine. Could I trust that? Or was it just my longing creating meaning where there was none? The next day, when I saw him at the grocery store, my heart did its now familiar flutter as he waved me over. "You have to try this," he said, holding up a bag of coffee beans with excitement. "Best thing I've ever tasted." I laughed softly. "You're very convincing." "Good," he said with a grin. "I'll take that as a yes." He tossed the bag into my basket, his hand brushing mine briefly. The touch was fleeting, accidental, yet it sent a jolt through me. He didn't pull away immediately, and our eyes met for a moment too long. I looked away first, my cheeks flushing. Was I imagining the way his gaze lingered? Or was there truly something unsaid in that moment? The doubt, the hope, the confusion. They all swirled together as I walked home. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, terrified to jump yet unable to step back. Could I take the leap? Could I risk my heart, knowing the fall might shatter me? Or was the possibility of something real with Daniel worth the chance of breaking? The idea to invite Daniel over had been circling in my mind for days, a persistent whisper that grew louder with every interaction. At first I dismissed it. What would he think? What reason could I possibly give that wouldn't seem contrived? But the thought refused to fade, and one evening, as I sat in the quiet of my living room, I found myself rehearsing the words aloud. I'm trying out a new recipe. Would you like to join me for dinner? Even in the stillness, it sounded flimsy, as though the subtext were written all over my face. The next day, as we bumped into each other by the produce aisle, the opportunity presented itself. He was choosing lemons, his brow furrowed in concentration. I watched him for a moment before summoning the courage to speak. Daniel, I began, my voice steady despite the fluttering in my chest. I was thinking of trying out a new recipe tomorrow evening. Would you like to join me for dinner? He looked up, surprised at first, but then his expression softened into that easy smile of his. I'd love to, he said, without hesitation. What's on the menu? I laughed, relieved. You'll have to wait and see. The rest of the day passed in a haze of anticipation and self-doubt. What had I done? Inviting him into my home was a step into uncharted territory, one that I wasn't sure I was ready for. The evening of the dinner, I found myself fussing over every detail. The table was set with my best dishes, candles lit in a way that felt warm yet casual. The meal, a simple but elegant pasta dish, was one I'd practiced countless times, hoping it would come across as effortless. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep breath before opening it. There he stood, a bottle of wine in hand, his smile as disarming as ever. You didn't have to bring anything, I said, stepping aside to let him in. Consider it a thank you for the invitation, he replied, his gaze sweeping over the room. This is lovely. We settled into an easy rhythm as the evening unfolded. Conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by laughter and moments of comfortable silence. He complimented the food, his sincerity evident, and I found myself relaxing more with every passing minute. As we moved to the living room for dessert, the atmosphere shifted subtly. The candles cast a soft glow, and the space between us felt charged, though neither of us acknowledged it aloud. Thank you for this, he said, his voice quieter now. It's been a while since I've had such a peaceful evening. I met his gaze, my heart skipping a beat. Me too, I admitted. For a moment, the air felt thick with unspoken words. Should I say more? Should I let the moment pass? What had I expected from this evening? And now that he was here, seated across from me, his presence filling my home, what did I truly want? The evening wore on, and with each passing hour, the space between us seemed to shrink, both physically and emotionally. We lingered over dessert, savoring the rich chocolate cake, but there was something more lingering in the air, an undeniable tension that neither of us spoke of but both could feel. I noticed how his eyes occasionally drifted to mine, as though searching for something, an unspoken question hanging between us. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the warmth flooding through me. This wasn't just a friendly dinner anymore. Something deeper, something more vulnerable, had woven itself into the fabric of the night. He took a sip of wine and set the glass down with a soft clink. Then, in a quieter voice, he said, I'm glad you invited me tonight. I didn't expect this, didn't expect us to have such a connection. My heart skipped a beat at his words. The warmth in his voice was unmistakable, and I felt the stirrings of something more than camaraderie. The idea that I, a woman in my 50s, could experience something like this with him, someone so much younger, still felt foreign to me, yet in this moment, it didn't seem strange at all. I feel the same, I murmured, surprised at my own honesty. It's been a long time since I felt this way. You make me feel alive in a way I hadn't realized I was missing. His gaze softened, and I could see something in his eyes that mirrored my own unspoken thoughts. The silence between us grew comfortable, and for a long moment, we simply sat there, each of us acknowledging the unspoken shift in our connection. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping as if sharing something private. I'm glad I came tonight. I don't know what it is, but there's something about you. Something I can't quite explain. It's not just the way you look. It's how you make me feel, like I'm seen, understood. His words caught me off guard, and I felt a sudden vulnerability wash over me. He wasn't simply flattering me. He was being open, honest, and raw in a way that felt completely authentic. The quiet of the room pressed in on us, and for the first time that evening, I felt the space between us close even further. My heart raced as I realized that the attraction I had been trying so hard to ignore had been quietly growing, weaving itself into the very fabric of this evening. I wanted to say something, anything, but my mind seemed to freeze in the face of the weight of this revelation. He seemed to sense my hesitation. "I'm not trying to make things complicated," he said softly, his voice reassuring. "I just wanted you to know that I don't take this, whatever this is, lightly." I nodded, my breath catching in my throat. There was an intensity in the way he spoke, a sincerity that made my chest ache with emotion. For so many years, I had built walls around myself, convinced that any connection, any vulnerability, would only lead to disappointment. But here in this room with him, it felt like something else, something real. "I'm glad you came too," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. I've been alone for so long. But tonight with you it feels different." He smiled softly, then reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before resting gently on mine. His touch was warm, reassuring, and I felt a jolt of something deep within me. We sat like that for a while, his hand in mine, both of us uncertain of what to say next. The evening had unfolded in ways neither of us had expected, but it had brought us closer, deeper, in ways I hadn't anticipated. The air between us felt charged with possibility, with the kind of quiet intimacy that I had longed for without realizing it. And in that moment, I knew that whatever happened next, this connection, this fleeting but significant moment, was something I would never forget. As the evening drew to a close, I found myself sitting quietly, the soft glow of the lamp beside us casting a warm light over the room. The clink of plates and the remnants of our dessert sat on the table, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't stop thinking about what had just unfolded between us. The intensity of the evening had left me feeling both fulfilled and conflicted, caught in the space between what was real and what was fear. I stood up, needing to move, needing to clear my head, but my heart was heavy with something I couldn't name. I had always told myself that I was beyond the age of foolishness, beyond the age where I could afford to fall for someone so much younger, someone whose life was still ahead of him. What would this mean for us? For me? For him? I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror, gray hairs at my temples, the soft lines of my face a testament to the years lived. It was strange to think that a woman like me, at this stage of life, could feel the stirrings of something as powerful as desire, something as raw and tender as love, for someone who had barely begun to live on his own terms. But there it was. The feeling was undeniable. He made me feel seen, truly seen, in a way that was entirely new. It wasn't just about physical attraction, though that was certainly there. It was the way he listened, the way he understood me with a depth I hadn't known I was longing for. He made me feel like I was more than just the sum of my years, more than the experiences I had accumulated. And yet, fear crept in like a shadow. What would people think? What would my friends say? What would my family think if they knew I had invited this young man into my life, into my home, into my heart? Society had very clear rules, and those rules didn't leave much room for love between two people so far apart in age. I could almost hear the disapproval, feel the weight of their judgment before they even spoke a word. Still, there was a part of me, an honest part of me, that knew this feeling was real, that knew it had to be honored, even if it didn't fit neatly into any of the boxes I had spent my life trying to stay in. Love didn't follow the rules of society, of age, or of propriety. It didn't care about the years that separated us. It cared about how two people felt when they were together, how they could see and understand one another in a way that transcended everything else. I took a deep breath and turned back to the living room, where he was still sitting, his presence filling the space with an unfamiliar comfort. I realized that I had spent so many years trying to fit into the roles expected of me. The dutiful daughter, the responsible friend, the cautious woman in her 50s who had learned to keep things under control. But now, in this moment with him, I felt like I was finally stepping outside those roles, finally letting go of the rigid expectations I had built up around myself. He was waiting for me. I could see that much. There was no rush, no urgency in his gaze. His quiet presence spoke volumes. He wasn't just here for the night, for the moment. He was here for something more, something that couldn't be rushed. As I approached him, I realized that the real question wasn't what society would think, or how my age would be perceived. It was whether I could allow myself to accept this connection, to embrace it without fear. Could I let go of the judgment, of the doubt, and let love be what it was, free from the constraints I had spent years building? With each passing moment, I knew that the answer was yes. Yes, I could love without reservation. Yes, I could accept the beautiful, complex, and unexpected nature of this bond. And in doing so, I could embrace not just the love I felt for him, but the love I was learning to have for myself. The love that had no age, no boundaries, and no rules. The weeks that followed were a blur of moments, each one etched into my memory like a soft whisper that wouldn't fade. I had come to accept something I had never dared to imagine before, that love wasn't limited by time, nor by the years I had lived. I had spent so much of my life waiting for love to come in a way that was familiar, predictable, and safe. But love had its own plans for me, unfolding in a way that was unexpected and undeniably powerful. I no longer worried about what people might say. I had learned that love wasn't something to be explained or justified to anyone except the people involved. It wasn't about age, or the years that separated us. It was about the moments we shared, the quiet understanding between us, and the connection that grew with every passing day. Looking back, I realized how much of my life had been spent in hesitation, in keeping things neat and orderly. I had avoided the messy parts of myself, the desires and passions that had once burned brightly but had been snuffed out by the weight of practicality. But with him, I felt like I was finally free to be who I was, without pretense, without fear. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly alive. There were days when the weight of our age difference seemed to vanish, when it didn't matter that we came from different worlds or had walked different paths. We had found something in each other that was greater than the sum of those differences, a connection that defied logic and reason, a love that existed in its own right. There were also moments when the world outside felt heavier, when the whispers of society crept in, but I had learned to ignore them, to embrace what was mine and let go of the expectations that others tried to place on me. Our love wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was messy, it was complicated, and it was beautiful. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was living the love story I had always dreamed of, not the one that society told me I should have, but the one that was written just for us. So, as I sat by the window one evening, watching the sunset with him beside me, I understood something that had eluded me for so long. Love doesn't belong to any age. It doesn't belong to any one phase of life. It is something that can bloom at any moment, in any form, no matter the obstacles or the judgments we face. The only thing that mattered was that we were here together, and that our love was a testament to the power of the heart to find its way, no matter the years that had passed, or the rules that had been set. I smiled, knowing that this was only the beginning of something profound, something that would shape the rest of my life in ways I couldn't yet understand. And for the first time in years, I felt hope, real, unshakable hope, hope that love, in all its forms, would always find a way.